The MHRA is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the United Kingdom, and its CEO is a woman called June Raine. And recently I was alerted to a speech that June Raine made in November 2022 about safety of medicines. And it's quite a remarkable speech because although she did talk about the work they were doing on the COVID vaccines, she said remarkably little about their safety. And there were some highly unusual parts of the speech which I want to highlight here. I encourage you to watch the full speech, which is linked in the description below. Near the start, she talks about the fact that her role as regulator is changing as a result of the pandemic.
My role as a regulator is changing, catalysed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but what won't change is that safety is our top priority.
Well, that's comforting to know, but is she really delivering on that promise?
What have we learnt from safety monitoring for vaccines and therapeutics during the pandemic? And that's not a simple matter of rearranging our teams and our leadership. It really means culture changing. From a regulator that's a controller, a watchdog, a policeman if you like, to an enabler or an air traffic controller landing the plane that is the new entity, the new asset. From a black box to a system partner.
Wow, that's quite a statement. So from controller, ensuring that unsafe vaccines don't get approved, to an enabler, which presumably means working with the pharma companies to ensure that vaccines get approved as fast as possible.
So often people have said we send in a yellow card and we don't know what happens.
Well, I can personally vouch for that. I never got an acknowledgement, let alone a follow-up of the very serious adverse reaction I reported on behalf of a loved one after the AstraZeneca vaccine. In fact, I believe it's no longer even on the system.
And so working in partnership is at the heart of our learnings from COVID. What great work has been done. You may have been thinking about how the NHS, the health technology assessment and the regulatory approval came together in our hour of need to deliver those important new vaccines and medical products, antivirals, therapeutics.
Self-congratulatory nonsense. We know how that worked out.
So this is how we're changing. It's a big change, but it's one that will really only work if we embed making medicine safer at the heart of everything we do. And so we often think of a cycle from picking up a signal to characterising a risk to ongoing evaluation of the benefits and the risks, and then steps to minimise those risks and monitor the effectiveness of those activities.
Was any of that cycle really applied during the rollout of the COVID vaccines?
And the bedrock, of course, the cornerstone of the way we pick up new risks is the yellow card scheme. It's been around for a very long time. Is it still fit for purpose? Absolutely yes. It is a unique way of picking up emerging information. And with the pandemic, we've gone even closer to real-time vigilance. I'll tell you a little bit more about that.
She now presents some remarkable historical data about how common serious adverse reactions to drugs and vaccines are.
Why is this so important? A groundbreaking piece of work, nearly 20 years ago now, estimated the proportion of hospital admissions due to adverse drug reactions, and it was an astonishing 6 to 7%, much in line with other international work. Responsible for deaths in a small percentage, 0.15, but importantly, around 2/3 were classified as avoidable. A further piece of work looked at the kind of data when a medicine comes off the market, and clearly, spontaneous data, those yellow card reports, are still the mainstay, the evidence base that we need to use, and therefore all the efforts that the Yellow Card Centre Wales makes are really extremely important.
So yellow cards are really important for identifying the enormous number of serious adverse harms caused by new drugs and vaccines. But is this what happened with the yellow cards for the COVID vaccines? As we shall see, no. Next, she talks about the Wales Yellow Card Centre 2021 to 2022 report.
The Centre has contributed enormously to detecting signals. Now, if you read the report, what you're looking for is actually the non-COVID report.
Yes, you heard that right. The report really does focus on everything other than the COVID vaccines, despite this being the very 2 years of the COVID vaccines rollout.
It's the vaccines and the therapeutics, and how the centre has maintained a finger on the pulse of the safety of medicines throughout this time. And you will be incredibly impressed, as I was, to see that increase in reporting rates despite everything happening in the pandemic.
So what she's saying here is the reporting of adverse reactions from drugs and vaccines which have nothing to do with COVID actually still increased during the pandemic. And what she's about to present now are the total yellow card report numbers for years 2019, 20 and 21, but completely missing out the COVID vaccine report numbers.
How did they do this? How did you do this? And I think some of the yellow card champions are here today. If you want to put your hands up, we'll want to celebrate what you've done. An amazing initiative here in Wales that has, if you like, set off other initiatives both nationally and internationally. That local outreach embodied in colleagues who are going out and encouraging reporting. So let's hear it for the yellow card champions.
Now these charts are remarkable for several reasons. First, note that they really do exclude the COVID yellow card reports, because for the whole of the UK in 2021, here you can see there were 43 reports per 100,000 people, which works out to about 28,000 reports total. Whereas of course we know, and she's about to reveal, that this is dwarfed by the 500,000 COVID yellow card reports in 2021. Next, note that contrary to what she just explicitly said, the reporting rates for the non-COVID stuff did not increase during the pandemic. But what's probably most revealing of all here is to note the difference in reporting rates between Wales and all the other parts of the UK. Because she said there was a special effort made in Wales to get people to report adverse reactions, the reporting rate in Wales is twice that of the UK as a whole and 3 times that of Scotland. Now, people are no more likely to suffer adverse reactions in Wales than anywhere else. So what this confirms is that even if a reasonable proportion of people suffering adverse reactions in Wales are reported to the yellow cards, then a massive number of people suffering adverse reactions elsewhere in the UK are not reported to the yellow card system. And this confirms what a lot of us have been saying, namely that the number of COVID vaccine yellow card reports is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Let me then turn to what we've learned from the pandemic. We knew that decisions would need to be made very quickly. Populations being exposed to large campaigns for vaccination, etc., and we would be picking up signals and running to evaluate them. Where did we start? We started really with an ambition to be flexible, a regulator, to use new technologies like the Yellow Card app, and to join up with colleagues. And I think that will be the story of what I'm going to tell you. This is a complicated slide, but it depicts 4 tracks of safety monitoring from the yellow cards, the spontaneous data on the left, where we were using artificial intelligence for the first time.
So she says they're using artificial intelligence for the first time, but never actually says what that means.
Having modelled about 100,000 reports, we received about 500,000 in a reasonably short space of time. So artificial intelligence there helping us.
Wow, so they expected 100,000 reports, which was already about 4 times the total annual number of reports for all other drugs, medicines and vaccines combined. But they quickly received 500,000. You'd think that might just be a massive safety signal. But what she's about to present provides no details of these 500,000 reports, but rather a bunch of platitudes and a clear attempt to play down the safety signals.
Setting up a cohort, the Vaccine Monitor, where people volunteered to help. 2,000 pregnant women volunteering to share their data, giving us a denominator. And then investing in rapid cycle analysis alongside collaboration with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, a tool first piloted in CDC in America, but enabling us to use clinical data rapidly, repeatedly, to answer questions such as Guillain-Barré and Bell's palsy. And of course, all of this accompanied by specific epidemiological studies. And I would like to pay tribute to Professor Evans, who must be of Welsh heritage, because he invented statistical tools which are now used worldwide, and they really are the basis of quickly identifying those signals. So hats off to Stephen Evans on this.
Now this is another incredible statement. In another video, which is linked in the description below, this PRR, the proportional reporting ratio, is exactly the method that the US CDC used to determine safety signals for COVID vaccines. And only after extensive delays to Freedom of Information requests did we get access to the CDC report, which revealed hundreds of genuine safety signals according to this method, which at any other time would have been sufficient to stop the vaccine programme.
And the rapid cycle analysis, again, a wholly new tool and methodology for keeping as close to real time as possible. Everyone knew that there would be issues to test that we were expecting, like Bell's palsy, but we needed to be as ready as we could to provide a definitive answer.
Note she admits here the particular safety issues, but apparently this is reassuring data.
So challenging times and challenging issues, and I would like to mention a particular signal, reports of thrombosis with low platelets, thrombocytopenia, which really challenged all our capabilities, and at least 14 of those reports came from Wales, adding to the total knowledge base. So quickly identified as a concern, unusual clots in the brain, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, and the health professionals involved were quickly able to look at as many as 300 cases gathered quickly, and again show that propensity for the cerebrovenous sinus site to be where the thromboses occurred, and to look at how these should be managed to minimise the risk. Anyone developing a headache to seek advice if this lasted longer than 4 days. But we can go further, and we are going further, to research the mechanism of vaccine-induced thrombosis with thrombocytopenia.
So finally, she admitted to one type of serious adverse event, but again, notice how she downplayed it. And also notice how, although her slide has this statement about the withdrawal of the AstraZeneca vaccine, she doesn't read that out, and not once in her talk does she specifically mention the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Why doesn't it happen more? Because it's really extremely rare, around 15 per million. So this is where science that delves into perhaps a genetic predisposition will unlock the answers, because viral vector vaccines are going to be a feature of health interventions in the future.
So having acknowledged the blood clotting issue, she's now trying to tell us that it was so rare that she's surprised there weren't more cases.
Communicating this kind of risk is going to be even more challenging, and here we enlisted the help of experts in the field. We knew from our yellow cards that there was an age distribution, more common the younger you got, and therefore how could we convey benefit risk, the balance that matters, for different age groups, and also to take into account how prevalent the disease was, how likely you were to need to go to ITU with an infection. And so this was the rather elegant model that helped you to see that the younger you got, that risk-benefit balance was going to be much closer, much narrower. And when the disease actually receded, we were able to raise the age limit under which you would be offered an alternative vaccine.
So the elegant model is one which compares per 100,000 people the number of ICU admissions due to COVID which are prevented by the vaccine with the number of serious harms due to the vaccine. But while this is a perfectly good way to represent risk-benefit, it needs to be based on accurate data. And what we now know is that this ICU admissions due to COVID prevented by the vaccine is completely made up. There's no hard evidence that any ICU admission was prevented by the vaccine. And of course, the serious harms here are massively underestimated. So this elegant model here is correct in principle, is completely bogus in what it's showing.
We've talked about transparency already today and the importance of public confidence. And here our chair, Munir Mohammed, going out there to communicate the risks and how the decisions are made. It has a downside though, with demonstrations outside our offices. This particular occasion you can see was quite an assertive demonstration, and I think it was the 4 Burley Met officers that came off worse while we were hiding under our desks. So transparency does have a downside, but thankfully there are ways to anticipate and take appropriate actions.
Well, isn't that brilliant? She was so committed to transparency that she decided to hide under her desk instead of going out to explain things to the protesters.
Talked a lot about the vaccines, but what about therapeutics? Here again I pay tribute to the work of the Yellow Card Centre, making sure that good data were always available to advise on drug-drug interactions, so that good advice could be given to those contemplating using Paxlovid, which has been the most commonly used antiviral. And to date we've had a very small number of suspected adverse reactions. When I looked it was 2 out of 1,000 reports on Paxlovid. Might have grown since then. So really important to see you can make medicine safer by anticipating these risks and having appropriate advice to hand.
Well, this is my final comment. Note that she said that there were only 2 out of 1,000 reports of adverse reactions to Paxlovid. I mean, it's curious that she didn't say 1 out of 500, but what I assume she means here is that only 1 out of every 500 yellow card reports was for Paxlovid. Now, assuming, as we now know, that there were about 500,000 yellow card reports for the period she's talking about, that still means there were 1,000 adverse reactions reported to Paxlovid. I think that this talk by June Raine from November 2022 confirms that the MHRA have not taken the enormous safety concerns of the COVID vaccine seriously. On the one hand, she stressed both how good the yellow card system was and how it was the critical driver for their safety analysis. Yet on the other hand, she seems to have largely ignored the 500,000 yellow card reports for COVID vaccines. In the links in the description below, you'll find a lot more evidence that the whole approach of the MHRA to the approval of the vaccines was fundamentally flawed, and that all its actions and responses since prove that the MHRA is not fit for purpose.